Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Amanda Vinicky. Paris Schutz and Brandis Friedman have the evening off. On the show tonight,
the indifference shown to my colleagues is disgraceful.
An emotional first day of hearings on the January 6th insurrection. Hear from local members of Congress on their reactions. An estimated 1.7 million Americans were displaced by natural disasters last year. We look into climate-induced migration. More than 2 years after a city watchdog report, the Chicago Police Department is still using the, quote, deeply flawed gang database. We share the details. Scientists led by a team from the University of Chicago discover a way to dramatically increase crop yields. The role celebrities like Michelle Obama and Naomi Osaka are playing in destigmatizing mental health. A summer of fresh produce and flowers. We check in with Chicago area street markets to hear how they're recovering from the pandemic. And vintage color photographs of Chicago people and places from the eye of Vivian Maier. But first, some of today's top stories. Chicago COVID cases are on the rise and headed toward a benchmark that could once again trigger restrictions. The city is on pace to hit 200 cases per day in the next few days, according to City Public Health Commissioner Dr. Allison Arwady. That would put Chicago in moderate risk territory. Lollapalooza is still on despite the ominous signs, and Arwady says city officials are not currently preparing for a new round of mask mandates or closures.
We certainly are concerned as numbers are increasing around the country. I expect to continue to see increases here. While it's summertime and we can gather out of doors, that remains the safer way to do so. And where people are feeling uncomfortable, we certainly encourage mask wearing, but we're not at a point where we're needing to recommend that for the whole population.
And Chicago's COVID travel advisory expands to 14 states due to rising COVID cases across the country. The new states are Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Kansas, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, and Wyoming. Unvaccinated travelers from these states, 5 others already on the advisory list, and the U.S. Virgin Islands are asked to quarantine or receive a negative test prior to their arrival in Chicago or quarantine for a 10-day period. An Illinois Republican member of Congress took center stage at today's hearing on the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Channahon Representative Adam Kinzinger was selected this weekend by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to serve on the Select Committee to investigate the events of January 6th. Kinzinger gave remarks and heard witness testimony from Capitol and D.C. Metro police officers who say they feared for their lives as they attempted to protect democracy that day. Kinzinger spoke afterwards, along with the panel's only other Republican, Wyoming Representative Liz Cheney.
This is a historic moment, and this is a democracy-defending moment. And no matter the consequences, me and I know Liz will stand and defend democracy.
And we'll have more on this with local members of Congress in just a few moments. More Chicagoans with lead water service lines can apply to have them replaced. City officials are announcing that any household with children under 18 that meets income eligibility requirements can apply for the federally funded program to replace lead service lines, and that is regardless of whether or not high levels of lead have been detected in water. Lead service lines connect approximately 400,000 Chicago homes with water mains buried under city streets. Chicago has more lead service lines than any other city in the country. You can read more about this on our website. The House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attacks heard testimony for the first time today from law enforcement officers who fought to defend the Capitol from insurrectionists. Here's what Illinois Congressman Adam Kinzinger told them.
You talk about the impact of that day, but you guys won. You guys held. You know, democracies are not defined by our bad days. We're defined by how we come back from bad days.
Joining us to talk about that and much more are Congressman Danny Davis, a Democrat from the Austin neighborhood in Chicago, Congressman Brent Schneider, a Democrat from Deerfield, and Congresswoman Marie Newman, a Democrat from Chicago's southwest side. We did invite every Republican in the Illinois delegation, as well as Republican members from surrounding states, to join this discussion, and none said yes. But thanks to the three of you for joining us right now. And as you just heard, Congressman Kinzinger got pretty emotional during this morning's hearing. Representative Schneider, do you think that the testimony changed hearts and minds at all?
I certainly hope so. I mean, these are our four officers who testified, who experienced what, I'm sure for them was perhaps the worst day of their lives. I know for me, I was in the gallery. I took cover as the mob was trying to break in to the House chamber. I owe my life to the Capitol Police. They protected me and my colleagues, and as Adam Kinzinger said, they protected our democracy. And their voices, it's essential that they're heard, that their stories are told, and that we get a full understanding of what happened January 6th so it never happens again.
Representative Newman, what are you looking to learn from these hearings? They happened 6 months ago. We all watched, many of us in horror, about what went down. What can be gleaned?
Well, thank you for having me. And, you know, I think this is really simple. I think this committee is dedicated to getting at the truth. Why did this happen? Who was engaged in this process? And better understand how we can avoid it from happening again. Because the spirit of this is much like the 9/11 Commission, we just want to get at the truth. That's what everybody wants, right? And reveal the truth, learn from it, and keep it from happening again. I think those are the critical objectives of this, but also to help the nation understand what our colleague, Mr. Kinzinger, said is that this was the worst day of our democracy since 1812. So let's remember it and address it.
Now, you heard very emotional, frustrated words as well from the members of law enforcement who were the first to give testimony, admonishing Republicans and others for undercutting, not wanting to get to the truth of what happened during those Capitol riots. And then at one point you had Officer Dunn saying that yes, he does believe that Congressman Kinzinger, and for that matter Cheney, the two Republicans on the panel, were courageous for doing so, though he questioned why it needed to be courage to simply, in his words, tell the truth. So I would like to pose this just briefly to each of you. Do you consider Kinzinger's participation courageous? Each of you. Let's start with you. Pardon me. Go ahead.
I'll take a shot at that. I think that not only were they courageous, but I think they were honest in their assessments of what they felt and what they saw. And given the fact that we never expected our democracy to be attacked in the way that it was, it seemed so unreal. But I think it reinforced the understanding that democracy is real and that people do in fact believe it and believe in it. And to think that we were under attack, sieged by individuals in our own country, that's hard to take, but we need to understand it, to know it, and know that we must protect at all costs our democracy.
And I'll add to that if I can. Look, I think both Congressman Kinzinger and Cheney, Congresswoman Cheney, deserve the respect for standing up for the truth. But the only reason it's being called courageous at this point is because they are 2 out of more than 200 Republican voices willing to stand up and speak the truth, willing to do the necessary work for our country to ensure that nothing like January 6th ever happens again. So they're doing the right thing, but the reflection of courage is only because they are alone within their caucus or conference doing the right thing.
Briefly, Congresswoman Newman, does that undermine this entire effort that Congressman Kinzinger said his participation hopefully would bring that bipartisanship to it and weed out any sort of belief that this is a false act? But is it all undermined by the lack of GOP support?
Well, I hope through the process that some of these folks that are not supporting Congressman Kinzinger and Congresswoman Cheney, that they come around. You know, stranger things have happened when we have instances like this in our democracy. Sometimes people come around and regain their senses. So first of all, I just want to say how appreciative I am to Kinzinger and Cheney for stepping up in the face of adversity in their own party. So we deeply appreciate them. We're happy to work with them and have this be a bipartisan effort. And I hope that people come around from this.
Now, let's switch gears some and talk about infrastructure negotiations. Representative Schneider, you are part of the Problem Solvers Caucus and also the bipartisan working group. So are talks nearing a deal or blowing past a Monday deadline? Are there just too many roadblocks, if you will?
Well, thank you for the question. And it's so critical that we pass infrastructure, that we get a robust package that moves our country forward. As you mentioned, I am part of the Problem Solvers Caucus. We put forward the compromise proposal that's now being discussed in the Senate. Unfortunately, the next steps are in the Senate where I don't have the insight, but this shouldn't be partisan. Infrastructure affects every single community, every single district in our country. Our nation has been getting a D grade for the last 2 decades. We should be leading the world in infrastructure, making sure that our communities have what they need to compete and succeed in the 21st century post-COVID economy. And if the Senate fails us at this point, we're just going to fall further behind.
Congresswoman Newman, do you expect a deal by August before the recess?
Well, we just got a briefing on that this morning, and I sit on transportation and infrastructure. I believe that the House has acted. As you know, we passed a great bill that addresses equity and innovation and bringing our roads and bridges up to snuff and moving us forward. As I always say, there are no Democratic roads and Republican bridges, or, you know, they're all American bridges and roads, right? And we need to bring them up to a point where we're in a better position as a country, but for all of our workers so that they can get to work, right? I will say that we are going to hold fast in the House that if they do not combine it with an actual reconciliation package, it is not a deal. So our recommendation to our Senate partners is go back and make sure you're supporting transit agencies, that you're addressing climate, and that this bill actually brings us into the 21st century and not draw us backward.
Now, Attorney General Merrick Garland was in Chicago just 2 days last week, and he called gun violence an ongoing tragedy. Congressman Davis, he rolled out a gun task force, and yet violence continues to go up. What else can and should be done?
Well, I think the base of some of the violence is indeed poverty. It's indeed lack of satisfaction and feeling on the part of many people. There are far too many guns floating around in our country, and we must find a way to reduce the presence of guns in the hands of people who should not have them. They ought not be able to get them. They only law enforcement, military people should have some of the weapons. But I think in addition to all of the other things that the Attorney General talked about and the plan, all of those are great ideas. But for a city like Chicago, I would add to that serious, what I call block club organizing in the most affected communities, that the people themselves must be organized in such a way that they create standards for the neighborhoods and communities where we live, because I live in one of those. I live in the Austin area, the largest community area in the city. And yes, government, police, law enforcement, laws, all of these things matter, but the first line of defense must be the people ourselves.
And we'll leave that with our parting words for our congressional panel today. Much appreciation to each of you, Representatives Danny Davis, Brad Schneider, and Marie Newman.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Thank you.
An estimated 23 million people have been displaced by natural disasters every year since 2010. That's according to the World Meteorological Organization. While it's not an official designation, some call climate-induced migrants climate refugees. And as rising sea levels, destructive floods, droughts, and wildfires threaten communities in the U.S. and across the globe, some say governments need to prepare for more migration. Joining us to discuss climate-induced migration and what it means for the U.S. are Sabina Scheck, director of the University of Chicago's Program on Global Environment, and Kathleen Arnold, director of DePaul University's Refugee and Forced Migration Studies program. Sabina, let's start with you. What does the term climate change refugee mean?
Hi, I think that question was for me. Sorry,
yes.
I couldn't hear you before. Thanks. Well, I think the term refugee is defined formally by the United Nations as of a person who's crossed international borders out of fear of persecution or disruption. Climate refugee, the term is not formally acknowledged under this definition, since a lot of the movement we see in response to climate change is internal, within borders, or secondary, causes secondary displacement. But aside from the technicality, I think when we hear the term climate refugee, we're talking about the mounting evidence of movement both within and across borders due to climate hazards, but also accumulated events and chronic conditions caused by climate change. Just quickly, regardless of that terminology, I think it's critical to recognize that the burden of these climate hazards is unequal, and there's wide differences in how it affects people across countries, within a country, even across neighborhoods within a single city, partly due to geographic conditions, but really an outcome of deeper rooted inequalities that make certain populations more vulnerable to climate change and displacement.
And just briefly there, when you say populations, are these people of color? Is it particularly impoverished individuals? Or I'm thinking a lot of rich folks have homes along shorelines that are getting flooded out, for example. So can you explain?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a confluence of factors that will influence how people are affected by climate change. And certainly, it may be that exposures to the hazards may be different for different people, but it's really the sort of what happens after the hazard as well. So I think that there's unequal economic conditions, lack of political representation, racial inequities, and different social structures. All of these things matter significantly. So, I think I heard something about infrastructure in that last segment, and that's something where we have to think really broadly, beyond the idea of gray physical construction, and consider these differences and infrastructure is defined as economic and technological, natural, and social infrastructure, so that climate change planning doesn't further exacerbate inequality in either in its design or its outcomes.
And let's put this further into perspective. Since 2008, about 318 million people around the world have been displaced by climate disasters. That's according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. That includes 156 million people displaced by floods, 119 million people by storms, and 33.5 million individuals displaced by earthquakes. Now, Kathleen, let's bring you in. What are the reasons that people are displaced? Is it in the immediate aftermath of these disasters, or is it more cumulative effects?
Yeah, I think climate change, and in certain respects, has happened very quickly, but there's also a very slow process by which people have been affected. We have enough warning signs. The aftermath is certainly important, especially the degree to which we have been over-vetting refugees and kind of building walls against migrants. But, as Sabina and I were talking earlier, and most migration happens internally. There's quite a lot we could do to ensure that the ecosystem isn't destroyed, that toxic waste dumping doesn't occur to the degree that it is occurring, and it definitely disproportionately affects, as Sabina just said, people who are poorer. Very often women gather water, for example, women and children, they have difficulties getting water. They're also disproportionately affected if some sort of disaster occurs, because climate refugee displacement doesn't just occur because of big disasters, but also kind of slow accumulating ones. And so very often people who have very little resources for mobility and so on and so forth are going to be stuck, whereas the rich people you just referred to will be able to move more easily.
No, this is, of course, happening globally, but as well internally within the United States. Are there particular areas of the country, or are we even seeing any examples of this in the Chicago area? And I will pose that question to you, Sabina.
Okay, sure. I think in the U.S. there's a lot of speculation that people will migrate to water-rich or climate-protected areas, those who can anyway, and those who have the ability to move. I don't think it's, entirely evident at the moment that this is sort of some kind of permanent movement, as cities with the highest population growth are places with high exposure to coastal and heat hazards rather than places in the Midwest right now. But I think we're seeing more of the impact of climate change on housing, on transit systems, certainly on energy and water infrastructure, and all of these are going to play into future population movement.
Almost counterintuitive there, where you're seeing those population explosions. Kathleen, kind of conversely, is Chicago prepared to handle if there is an influx of climate refugees? Is this something the city is preparing for and able to prepare for?
I mean, Chicago is certainly, they seem to be authorizing new construction in my neighborhood and in other neighborhoods. To me, that's a bit chilling. Obviously, we need, I think, more unification as a country on this so that we don't have this kind of vision of people kind of rushing into Chicago, because that's almost like the fear of climate-induced migration from abroad. But yeah, I think there's quite a lot going on the West Coast, right, that would be concerning. I don't think they're going to immediately move here, but we do need to kind of unify as a country and also internationally, including with the infrastructure bill you were just talking about, right? I've just read that they dropped a number of green-friendly proposals from that bill to get it passed. And that's not great messaging. It shouldn't be a trade-off. This is something that's urgent, but it's not going to lead to hordes or masses of people rushing to Chicago, I don't think yet.
And Sabina, we only have about 30 seconds left, but what needs to be done further? We've talked about a lot of this already, but to further address climate-related migration, is there a very quick example you could give us?
Well, I think that, when you're talking about Chicago, the city and the region can be well positioned to attract investment related to water resources and to, attract people to Chicago. But I think a lot of it depends on how we plan and manage freshwater, but also climate hazards like urban flooding and heat. And all of this is related to resilient infrastructure and housing, education, furthering programs for racial justice and natural resource protection. I think those are all really part of this picture.
Thank you so much to Sabina Scheck and also Kathleen Arnold.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, vintage photographs of Chicago people and places. Stay with us.
It really is about community, where we all come together.
Chicago needs to make space for everyone.
There's much more ahead on the program, including a scientific breakthrough aimed at addressing global hunger. But first, when she died 12 years ago, photographer Vivian Maier went from anonymous to fairly famous. She's had books on her work published, an Oscar-nominated documentary, and photo exhibits all over the world. Now, the one-time North Shore nanny is receiving more posthumous praise. This time, it's for a show of her mostly unseen color photographs of people and places. Chicago Tonight's Mark Vitale recently went for a visit. Here's another look.
She took many images of children, sometimes the kids that she cared for. And she had a sensitive eye for Chicago buildings and infrastructure. There are scenes of the Loop in 1970 and the rubble from the demolition of the Chicago Stock Exchange. When she was alive, Vivian Maier was unknown to curators and historians. Now she's getting the second show of her work at the Chicago History Museum. And it's all in vivid color.
We look across the spectrum of activity in Chicago and look for ways to reveal something about Chicago, Chicago-ness, the people who are here, what are they doing, how are they shaping how we think about the place we live in. Creativity comes out in a lot of these sort of questions as we're asking ourselves, what are people doing and how are they sort of reflecting the city in that. So to look at this work, I think, is to reveal something not only about her, this amazing artist, and the quality of the work that she generated, but something about us as well.
If you're familiar with Vivian Maier's work, you know about her self-portraits. She often found inventive ways to document her presence in the photographs. Most of these color works are focused in and around Chicago.
One of the things I really like about looking at her work is that sometimes it's not evident. You don't immediately see it as a Chicago work, and yet a little bit of time, you sort of capture a sense that this reflection is of that building, and you can sort of ground this scene she's photographing in context, in a place in Chicago. So place is really clearly important to her.
The exhibition includes a selection of Super 8 movies that she shot, including more on the demolition of Adler & Sullivan's Stock Exchange building. The works came from a donation to the Chicago History Museum by a local art collector who wants the pictures to be accessible.
She's able to walk that fine line between being sort of voyeuristic and dispassionate and being so empathetic that she sort of can figure out how to sort of live within that small, intimate world that person is in at that moment, and yet continue to keep her art-making self on task, which is to capture this picture at the right time, with the right light levels, with the right framing, time and again. I think that's one of the ways that Vivian and her history can inspire us, right? I mean, here is this amazing artist who never had the sort of critic's eye, never had any popular success, in our culture, and yet was creating these fantastic works. And it gives me hope, right, that our world is more full of creativity and great art making, and maybe even something that comes to genius that we have time to elevate and recognize and give attention to.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
If you're new to the Vivian Maier story, visit us online to see Jay Shevsky's original report on the discovery of her work. It's an epic story with more great photographs of Chicago people and places. The show of Vivian Maier's color photos is open for a long run at the Chicago History Museum. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, the Chicago Police Department is still using a gang database that a city watchdog found to be filled with errors. We share the details. A potentially world-changing discovery as scientists from the University of Chicago find a way to dramatically increase crop production. The role of celebrities like Michelle Obama and Naomi Osaka are playing in destigmatizing mental health in the Black community. And a summer of fresh produce and flowers. We check in with 3 Chicago area street markets to hear how they're recovering from the pandemic. But first, some more of today's top stories. New federal guidance on masks as the COVID Delta variant surges in certain parts of the country. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommends all individuals, vaccinated or not, wear a mask in indoor public settings in areas with substantial and high transmission. Illinois public health officials say the state will follow the new CDC guidelines as new cases in Chicago are approaching 200 cases per day. The CDC defines high transmission as 100 cases for every 100,000 people over a 7-day period. Governor J.B. Pritzker signs a package of bills aimed at advancing rights for the state's LGBTQ+ community. The new laws include a measure that expands infertility insurance to LGBTQ+ families and a repeal of the state's HIV criminalization law. The governor says that last piece will go a long way to reducing the stigma of HIV and AIDS.
It's high time that we treat HIV as we do other treatable, transmissible diseases, thereby treating our residents with dignity and furthering our mission to end this epidemic in Illinois.
And we'll have more on this new set of laws tomorrow on our program. Netflix announces it's making an adult cartoon series out of a popular local Twitter account. Chicago Party Ant, based on the fictional Twitter handle of the same name, will debut on the streaming service in September. The series will follow the exploits of a Chicago woman who's always the life of the party and one who enjoys a healthy intake of Malort and Italian beef. It's based on a character created by comedic actor Chris Wysocki. Although it's been more than 2 years since the city's watchdog said gang records used by Chicago police were riddled with errors, the department says it's still using that same database. WTTW News reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more. Hey, Heather. Before we talk about today's hearing, let's start with that watchdog report from 2 years ago. Inspector General Joe Ferguson conducted an audit of CPD's gang database back in 2019. Remind us, what did it find?
Well, it found that more than 135,000 Chicagoans were listed in the database, and 95% of them were Black or Latino. But that data was riddled with error, Inspector General Joseph Ferguson's found, and was ripe for abuse, especially when it comes to undocumented immigrants in Chicago, and was disproportionately targeted toward Black and Latinos. And he recommended a huge number of changes.
And so, despite relying on all of that today during a hearing before the City Council's Public Safety Committee, CPD defended continuing to use this criminal enterprise database. Why did department officials say why?
Well, they said that it's important that Chicago police know who is in a gang so they can use that information to try to stop retaliatory violence, because so many of the gang-related shootings in Chicago involve violence that starts with one shooting that leads to another, and so on and so forth. They acknowledged that the data they have is not perfect, but they said it's important to use what they have.
Particularly wanting to connect the dots in this time of high crime. But is there any hope for changes in how the CPD uses this, or even how it keeps these records?
Yes, a new database is due to be online by September, Deputy Chief Thomas Mills told Alderman. However, all of the details have yet to be worked out. It's not clear how much the database will cost, exactly who will be included in the database, and precisely how those listed in the database can appeal that ruling. All recommendations set by the Inspector General that nearly 2.5 years later, we're still waiting to figure out.
Wait and follow we will. Thank you so much, Heather.
Thanks, Amanda.
And you can read Heather's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. Up next, details into new research on how to dramatically increase crop yields. Stay with us.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
Almost 1 billion people around the world don't have enough food to eat. That's according to the United Nations World Food Program. But in a potentially world-changing discovery, scientists led by a team from the University of Chicago have found a way to manipulate RNA to boost crop production by a lot. In field tests, both rice and potato plants increased their yields by 50% and also became more resistant to drought. Joining us now is one of the scientists who led this research, Xuan He, the John T. Wilson Distinguished Service Professor of Chemistry, Biochemistry, and Molecular Biology at the University of Chicago. Thanks so much for joining us. And if you could please begin explaining, how is it that you were able to modify these plants so that they can grow and produce so much more?
Yeah, my work is in the field of gene expression regulation. So as you said, we work on RNA that profoundly affects gene expression. So what we discovered is essentially a switch that regulates plant growth. And this switch is previously not known to scientists. We've shown a simple way to activate that switch so that plants grow with deeper roots, a lot more biomass, and of course more yields for crops.
How easy is it to flip this switch on or off?
It's actually quite easy. Now for most plants, previously people would have to learn how their gene expression is wired in order to figure out new ways to boost their growth. And here what we show is that we do not need to know much about a particular plant. we can add this human protein into the plant and boost its growth. So it seems to be a quite general approach.
And we're seeing on our screen, on the left, the controls, and on the right, these much larger plants and potatoes produced by those plants. So you've tried flipping this switch on rice and on potatoes, but will it work on more than that?
That's a good question. In fact, in addition to rice and potatoes, my collaborators have tried other plants. So far, we've tested 5 to 6 different types of plants, including trees and grass. And in all these cases, the approach in general works for all of them.
So trees and grass, in what ways might that be helpful? I think it's obvious, perhaps, if you yield more rice, more potatoes, that could help to feed people with food insecurities. But what would a tree with deeper roots mean, or having grasses that are more plentiful?
Right. Well, I always joked with trees with deeper roots, right? Here I'm in Hyde Park. When the storm comes over, blow over our trees with deeper roots will probably survive the storm better. Now, what's really happening is these trees and grass grow with more biomass. They have increased the photosynthesis and they grow with a lot more branches.
And by growing those branches, deeper roots, could that have an impact? For instance, we're talked a lot about climate change and more storms, more severe storms, and further, more droughts and more severe droughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. As you just said, the first sort of thing come to our mind is of course food security, right? It's not a major concern for this country, but for the rest of the world, it's a pretty significant challenge, particularly with growing population. Now, in addition to food, I also want to mention the plant stock materials, right? Plants offer a lot more other things to us. We rely on plants for, say, woods, rubber, natural products, and flowers. We think we have a general way to boost the production of all these materials. Now, speak about climate change. These plants have deeper roots and they're more drought resistant. And we're really hopeful that they survive under extreme growth conditions better. So we envision these plants can preserve or even improve ecosystems. They can perhaps prevent spread of deserts and better solidify soils, and at the same time offer more biomass. Now, lastly, I want to say that, as you mentioned, if we can produce more foods, right? People may not need to cut trees down to have more lands for farming. So hopefully we can save these lands to preserve forests.
And yet you're, of course, manipulating plant proteins through RNA. And many people are concerned about genetically modified foods. So how can people be secure that foods produced in this way would be safe to eat?
That's a great question. So genetically modified means you directly modify DNA. Now we work on RNA, we added RNA, we do not need to touch DNA. So in principle, we do not need to genetically modify plant. Now in reality, in this paper or in research, we do add this human protein into plant genomic DNA in order to observe this phenotype. However, we've already worked out a way to avoid adding any genetic modifications to plant genome. So in the real world application, when this really be translated to solve, say, our challenges, we're going to apply approach without genetic modified plants.
So you would eat one of those potatoes, or did you try one of those giant potatoes?
I would love to. We haven't done that, but I would eat the potatoes even out of the genetically modified. But as I said, in the real applications, we're going to avoid completely the genetic modification.
And then before we wrap up, how soon might this be used beyond the laboratory? What is the future of this research?
Right. Say I'm a basic scientist, so my focus in the future will be trying to understand what's really going on. But I, of course, welcome different research labs, corporates, or entities to work with us and collaborate with us, apply this to solve real-world challenge. I would predict in 3 to 5 years we'll see it being used in real fields. And hopefully in 5-6 years, we may start to see this impacts our everyday life.
Well, we hope to have you back to learn more about that. Much appreciation. Our thanks to Xuan He.
Thank you.
COVID-19 has affected the Chicago area's many street markets in different ways. Some temporarily closed shop, but this year, the majority of them are back with safety protocols at the forefront. Joining us to discuss how some local street markets have been adjusting to the ongoing pandemic are David Wolf, owner of the Wolf's Flea Market in Rosemont, Nicole Benjamin, Director of Special Events with the Lincoln Square Ravenswood Chamber of Commerce that runs the Lincoln Square Farmers Market, and Esmeralda Garcia, Board President of the Pilsen Community Market. Nicole, we'll start with you. What has reopening looked like for the Lincoln Square Farmers Market this season? This question, by the way, posed by an avid farmers market shopper and lover.
Well, this season has been wonderful. We actually started a month earlier than we usually do. So we started in May as opposed to June, because last season, even though it was a rocky start, ended up being incredibly successful as a community spot for people to come, feel safe, and shop. So we have double the amount of farms and vendors this season. We've expanded into the plaza next to our typical space. So we have about 40 vendors, and it's been as busy as ever.
In contrast to that, however, David, the Rosemont Flea Market was closed last season, but now returning. What has it been like for vendors and customers since coming back?
Well, I think people really want to be outside, especially because of COVID. Us being an all-outdoor market, we've seen a very large increase in our customer count this year as opposed to 2019. So our business has been great. We've seen a lot of new types of customers. A lot of people have refound their collections from the past. A lot of like baseball card collectors rediscovered their passion for baseball card collecting during the pandemic because they were home all the time. And now a lot of these people are vendors and our customers. So we've been doing very well.
So taking up that hobby on both ends. And Esmeralda, let's bring you in. How has the pandemic affected how the Pilsen Community Market operates?
Well, we are a community market first, so it has been a little bit difficult to deal with some of the challenges. We want to be able to bring the community in, have the local shoppers know where they're getting their things from, have the local producers be participant. And in terms of the space restrictions throughout, it had made it a little bit challenging, but we know that our customers and the local community really looks forward to the farmers market every year. And we've seen that be the fact this year and as well as last year.
So challenges, space restrictions, what do you mean by that? The social distancing requirements, people needing, both vendors and buyers needing to stay apart from one another along lines? What are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about, one, there's a lot of vendors who don't exactly have food. We're not exactly a flea market, but we are a farmers market. However, there's a lot of local producers, and because we want to give space to everyone, and there is a need for 70% food and 30% non-food, be the farmers market category in order to be a farmers market. It has posed a few challenges for us as a community market, but we also look for the safety of our customers and our vendors as well. We've done things to mitigate that or to make it safe for everyone and meet the needs.
Now, Nicole, you mentioned that last season was successful even during the height of the pandemic. Are you seeing similar trends this year? And can you perhaps explain what maybe precautions were taken then versus now?
Sure. Well, I will say that while last season did end up becoming successful, it was a nail biter. And I'm grateful that we were able to turn lemons into lemonade, so to speak. But being able to implement the protocols, needing equipment that we didn't have, bringing on a team of volunteers that we didn't need before to work with our market manager, to keep capacity limits, to count, to make sure all the vendors and the shoppers felt safe, which they did. And I think speaking to what Esmeralda and David said, you know, having an outdoor space where people feel safe to shop, and they're purchasing food that has touched the least amount of hands as possible, going from farm to market to table. And this season, we've just seen more of that now that we've been able to lift the restrictions up until now. So the market is a bit more open, but we got a lot more farms and food vendors who wanted to participate in our market last season, who appreciated that we maintained our market safely as an in-person market. So that's why we've been able to grow the footprint and move into the plaza space as well. And, you know, working for the Chamber of Commerce, you know, we do always try to add a benefit to the small businesses in the neighborhood who fully support the market, because they're just a few steps away and people can shop at Midklug Farm or Jacobson Family Farms or Los Rodriguez Farm. And then if they need some spices, they can walk up to Savory Spice Shop and purchase what else they need to make dinner, jump across the street to buy a bottle of wine at Augusta. So it's been really good this season so far. I'm grateful.
You're making people hungry and thirsty, I'm sure, with that. Now, David, after taking that break, and I understand also one of the challenges has been getting vendors, some of whom feel uncomfortable. Are you close to getting back to 2019 levels?
Yeah, we definitely are. The beginning of the year was very, very challenging with a lot of the COVID restrictions that were in place. A lot of our, as a lot of businesses are having challenging getting employees, we needed a lot of extra employees there due to capacity counts, and we had to make sure people were wearing their masks, so we had to have a lot more employees. And again, there's been a big challenge this year in finding employees. But we're, as COVID restrictions have eased, you know, the need for employees has eased a little bit, still tough, but it's eased a little bit. But we're pretty much back to normal. I mean, our vendor count is pretty much where it was in 2019. And I think I mentioned before, our customer count is, we're up 20% for 2019. This is probably our most successful year ever customer-wise, so which, you know, was a bit of a surprise to me.
Congrats for that, and once again, appreciation to each of you. Happy farmers market shopping and selling season. Once again, Nicole Benjamin, David Wolf, and Esmerna Garcia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, Brandis Friedman and Breaking Cycles of Trauma in a conversation that first aired on Sunday's Chicago Tonight Black Voices. But first, a look at the weather.
Breaking intergenerational cycles of pain takes self-examination and self-love. A new book breaks down the internal experiences of stress, trauma, and unacknowledged emotional suffering that Black women have faced for generations, while offering a new way of being strong that involves being comfortable with vulnerability. It's called Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen: The Emotional Lives of Black Women. And the book's author, Inger Burnett Ziegler, joins us now. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. Inger, welcome back. I'm thrilled that we are finally able to have you on to talk about your book, because we've talked with you a few times during this pandemic about navigating that. So first, why did you want to write this book?
You know, Brandis, it was clear to me that there were far too many Black women in deep emotional pain, and simply not enough people paying attention to it. And that pain is rooted in a variety of factors. It's rooted in generational family trauma, people who are confronting everyday racism, sexism, and discrimination, feelings of rejection by being denied opportunities that Black women know that they have rightfully earned. And, you know, knowing that we have to carry so much, that we're expected to not only do it all, but do it all on our own. And these feelings we're carrying around internally like a ticking time bomb, and they're eating away at us. They have real significant impacts, not only on our mental health, but also our physical health. We know that stress and trauma are closely related to physical health, and extending from that, our life expectancy, whereby Black women have a 3-year shorter life expectancy than white women. And so I wanted Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen to show the other side of what strong Black women show the world. And by doing that, offer the space to pay attention to these difficult emotions that many of us are experiencing, and open the door toward receiving the necessary support that we need.
And we're going to talk about the strong Black woman moniker in a minute, but I wanted to mention I made it to page 2. And I read something that was familiar to me as a Black woman. You mentioned your grandmother telling your mother telling you in different words, life ain't fair, so don't expect it to be. That's a quote. The version of my family was, who told you life was fair? Why do we pass this tough love on through the generations?
You know, I think that we are trying to teach our young girls that life as a young Black girl, as a young Black woman, as an older Black woman is going to be tough. We're trying to toughen up our girls so that they will have the tools that they need in order to be able to survive, to get through society. But you know, by doing that, we're not honoring those emotions that are also a part of that picture. We're not paying attention to the sadness, to the depression, to the anxiety. And by teaching girls only to be strong, we're also kind of minimizing and dismissing those other feelings that may be lying below the surface.
Now, you know, we often hear about the strong Black woman, and you mentioned it a minute ago as well. 2 things. Why do we feel the need to add the word strong? We're obviously Black women. But can that also be a point of pride in the face of adversity?
It's absolutely a point of pride. I definitely, you know, have held being called a strong Black woman as something that I'm proud of. And it's really many of the strengths that we so deeply admire in each other, the way we hold our heads up, the way we're able to be resilient, the way we're able to overcome difficult circumstances, to kind of make a way out of no way, and, you know, be able to deal with hard times. But the other side of that is avoiding and denying, you know, what's happening on the inside. And, you know, that's what I offer in this book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, is that we can be proud, strong Black women, but also allow ourselves to be vulnerable and acknowledge the difficult experiences that we've had, acknowledge the emotions that come with that, the way that it impacts our lives behaviorally, the way it impacts our relationships. And in doing that, we can move out of a space of shame and isolation and build community in understanding and open ourselves up to receive the community support and resources that we need.
Have you noticed in the Black community, has there been a recent shift to destigmatize mental health?
I absolutely think that, you know, this is a pivotal time in terms of talking about mental health, particularly in the Black community. I think that celebrities that are speaking out about their mental health are playing a critically important role in that. People like Michelle Obama, Meghan Markle, Naomi Osaka, Serena Williams, Beyonce, these women who are beautiful and revered, who are also talking about difficult times that they've had. And, you know, when people do that, that really gives, you know, the everyday Black woman permission to be able to acknowledge her own suffering and to know that she's not alone, and that there are other people that are going through the same experience.
The book is also part therapy. There are parts where, you know, you tell the readers to ask themselves certain questions and identify certain traits or feelings. What are you providing there and hoping that folks take away?
You know, one thing that I wanted to provide is to let people know what the signs and symptoms of some mental health challenges look like. So often we talk about trauma and depression and anxiety, and we throw these terms around, but people don't necessarily know what that looks like in their individual lives. And so I wanted people to be able to see that through real examples, to be able to acknowledge any signs or symptoms that might be showing up in them. And in doing so, be able to reflect, this is something that I'm going through. I have difficulty sleeping. I have difficulty getting out of bed. I'm finding myself irritable and on edge and afraid to leave my home. I'm having crying spells and deep sadness. And by recognizing and acknowledging that in ourselves, that awareness is the first step toward making behavioral change and for reaching out for support.
Okay, we've got about 20 seconds left. What do you want people to take away from this book? Why should they read it?
Our mental health, addressing our mental health is urgent. The time for us as Black women is to do so is right now. We are not alone, and we can be both strong and vulnerable, and our vulnerability does not mean weakness.
Okay, congrats to Ingrid Burnett Ziegler. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, the book is called Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, The Emotional Lives of Black Women, and you can read an excerpt on our website. Back to wrap things up right after this.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night, and please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Our Spotlight Politics team examines Illinois Republicans' reaction to the January 6th hearing from inside and outside the halls of Congress. And the governor signs a new law that allows transgender Illinoisans to change their names on marriage certificates. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Amanda Vinicky. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm named on the 2021 expertise list of the best personal injury attorneys in Chicago.